The streets of Cochabamba glowed with the flicker of dim street lamps as the warm evening air settled over the Bolivian city. It was March of 2015, and for many, the night promised little more than a quiet end to another day. But for two young lovers, Omar Adriazola, a national taekwondo champion, and Alejandra Saavedra, a bright and loving woman, the night would carry them into a darkness neither of them would ever escape. Omar was known throughout Bolivia not just for his fierce skills on the mat, but also for his charisma. He was disciplined, focused, and ambitious, the kind of man who seemed destined for greatness. His girlfriend, Alejandra, with her warmth and steady loyalty, grounded him. Together, they looked unstoppable, a pair who had big dreams and were ready to chase them side by side. But as with many stories where love burns bright, shadows were never too far away. Behind the smiles, behind the photographs of their happy moments, and behind their plans for the future, there were eyes watching them, hearts harboring jealousy, and hands already preparing a betrayal so cruel that it would shock the nation. On the evening of March 24th, Omar and Alejandra were last seen leaving a gathering with friends. They laughed as they walked to their car, unaware that this would be the final time anyone would see them alive. The night swallowed them whole, and by morning, a mystery would begin, one that would entangle family, friends, and enemies alike, in a web of deceit and violence. When they didn't return home the next day, worry began to spread. Omar's teammates noticed his absence from training, which was unlike him. Alejandra's family began to call her phone, only to be met with silence. By the second day, panic had set in. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Then came the discovery. That would send shivers through Bolivia. Their bodies were found dumped in a remote area, concealed but not carefully enough. Omar had been beaten, Alejandra brutally attacked. This was no accident, no random street crime. This was deliberate. This was personal. The whispers spread like wildfire. Who would want Omar and Alejandra dead? Why? The answers would not come easily, and the truth, when it surfaced, would prove darker than anyone could have imagined. For now, the city mourned. 2 lives filled with promise had been extinguished. But behind the grief lurked suspicion, and soon the investigation would rip open secrets that should have stayed buried. The story was just beginning.
The morning after Omar Adriazola and Alejandra Saavedra failed to return home, tension settled over Cochabamba like a heavy fog. Friends exchanged nervous calls. Families clung to their phones, dialing over and over, desperate to hear even the faintest sound of their loved ones' voices. But silence answered back, a silence more terrifying than any scream. Omar was never the kind of man to vanish without a word. His discipline, his training, his dedication to the sport of taekwondo had made him predictable in the best possible way. Alejandra, too, was reliable and responsible. For them to disappear together was not only unusual, it was unthinkable. By the second day, the whispers began. At training gyms, Omar's fellow athletes looked at the empty space where he should have been, their unease growing. At Alejandra's home, her family struggled with dread. Police were alerted, but in Cochabamba, missing persons cases often moved slowly unless clear signs of foul play were evident. At first, officials suggested that the young couple may have taken a short trip together, but Alejandra's mother shook her head firmly. She knew her daughter. Something was very, very wrong. It wasn't long before rumors started to swirl. Some claimed the pair had been robbed on their way home. Others whispered of enemies Omar might have made in competitions or in business. But those who knew them well couldn't accept these explanations. The truth felt closer, darker, and far more personal. On March 26th, their worst fears were realized. Police were called to a remote area outside the city, where 2 bodies had been discovered. Lying in the dust and half covered with brush, Omar and Alejandra's lifeless forms bore the marks of brutal violence. Omar's face showed signs of a savage beating, while Alejandra's body carried evidence of a desperate struggle. The scene chilled investigators. Whoever had done this hadn't acted in blind rage. It was deliberate, organized, and merciless. A staged robbery, perhaps, but the execution was sloppy. Their belongings were scattered, but valuable items remained untouched. This wasn't about money. It was something deeper. As news of the discovery spread, the city erupted in grief and outrage. Vigils were held, candles lit, and flowers piled at gym entrances and street corners. Omar had been a national champion, a source of pride for Bolivia. Alejandra had been a symbol of kindness and warmth. Together, their deaths left a wound in the community that refused to heal. But grief quickly gave way to suspicion. Families pressed investigators for answers. Friends whispered names behind closed doors. And soon, detectives would begin to connect threads that pointed in a direction few wanted to believe. A direction that would turn eyes inward, toward betrayal, not from strangers, but from people shockingly close. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a message, and someone had wanted both Omar and Alejandra silenced forever. The discovery of Omar and Alejandra's bodies set off an investigation that immediately split into two paths. On one hand, detectives combed through the crime scene, collecting fragments of evidence that might explain how two promising young lives had been extinguished so brutally. On the other, they turned their gaze inward toward the people who had known Omar and Alejandra best, their families, their closest friends, and anyone who might have carried a hidden grudge. At first, suspicion fell on faceless strangers. Perhaps the couple had been ambushed while traveling home, targeted by criminals who mistook them for wealthy prey. But the staged nature of the crime unsettled investigators. Too many valuables had been left behind. Whoever had killed them wasn't motivated by theft. It was personal. It was intimate. The questioning began. Omar's fellow athletes and Alejandra's circle of friends offered little more than grief-stricken. Tears and confusion. No one could think of anyone who wished them harm. Yet detectives noticed something unsettling during these conversations. Family dynamics that seemed strained, fractured, and complicated. Omar, though a celebrated athlete, was also the son of a wealthy family. Whispers soon emerged of tension surrounding inheritance, jealousy, and long-standing disputes simmering just beneath the surface. These weren't the kinds of rumors outsiders invented. They came from within, from relatives whose words were heavy with resentment and suspicion. One lead stood out almost immediately. A family member had reportedly expressed bitterness about Omar's success and his closeness to Alejandra. To them, the young champion represented not only a rival, but a barrier to something they desperately wanted: control over money, recognition, and power. The fact that Alejandra had been killed alongside him suggested she had become collateral damage, a witness who couldn't be allowed to speak. The police, cautious not to leap to conclusions, pressed harder. Bank records were examined. Family. Phone calls were quietly traced. Inconsistencies began to surface, stories that didn't match, alibis that stretched too thin, and expressions of grief that rang hollow. Then came the moment that turned suspicion into certainty. A crucial piece of testimony revealed that Omar and Alejandra's final hours hadn't been random at all. Someone close to them had orchestrated their deaths, planning the ambush with chilling precision. And it wasn't a nameless stranger. It was blood. Family. The betrayal struck like lightning. Cochabamba reeled as whispers spread that the killers weren't outsiders, but people Omar had once shared his home, his meals, and his trust with. The idea that jealousy and greed could drive relatives to murder a son and his girlfriend horrified the community. For investigators, the case had shifted. It was no longer about catching faceless criminals on the street. It was about proving a conspiracy rooted in envy and corruption, and unmasking a betrayal that cut deeper than any stranger's knife ever could. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous the truth became. Someone powerful didn't want the full story revealed, and they were willing to do anything to keep their secrets buried. When the arrests were finally made, the shock tore through Cochabamba like an earthquake. The accused weren't dangerous strangers or criminals lurking in the shadows. They were family, people bound to Omar by blood, people Alejandra had once been introduced to with polite smiles and gestures of trust. The betrayal was almost unthinkable, and yet the evidence pointed relentlessly toward them. Detectives revealed how the puzzle had come together. Bank transactions that had once seemed ordinary now looked sinister. Money moving through hidden accounts, debts piling up, and sudden, unexplained withdrawals. Combined with phone records and witness testimony, it painted a chilling picture of a conspiracy hatched not in a dark alley, but around dinner tables and quiet meetings behind closed doors. The courtroom became the stage where every buried truth clawed its way into the light. Families, once united by name, now sat on opposite sides, separated by suspicion, grief, and rage. Omar's fellow athletes filled the benches, their faces drawn and haunted, as if his absence still echoed through every breath they took. Alejandra's relatives clutched each other, their sorrow sharpened by the knowledge that her life had ended only because she had been in love with him. The prosecution moved with deliberate force, laying out the timeline, the motive, the greed that had curdled into murder. Step by step, they unraveled the lies, showing how the crime scene had been staged, how every move had been calculated to disguise a killing born of envy and betrayal. The defense pushed back, insisting there was no direct evidence, no weapon tying the accused to the crime. They painted the suspects as victims of assumption, scapegoats trapped in the whirlwind of public outrage. Every cross-examination became a battle of nerves, with tension so sharp it seemed to hang in the air like a blade. And then came the testimonies, the voices of those who had known Omar and Alejandra best. Friends described the young couple's plans, their dreams of building a future together. Coaches spoke of Omar's discipline, his determination to bring honor to his country through taekwondo. Neighbors remembered Alejandra's kindness, her quiet strength, her laughter that once lit up the street. Each testimony became a dagger, driving home the weight of what had been lost. But the most damning words came from within the family itself. A relative, pressed under the weight of evidence, finally broke down, admitting knowledge of the plot. It was not just suspicion anymore, it was confession. And with it came the chilling realization that Omar and Alejandra hadn't simply been victims of a crime. They had been sacrificed on the altar of greed. The courtroom murmured with outrage and disbelief. Outside, the streets filled with whispers and protests. How could a family turn on its own? How could jealousy twist love into something so venomous? The answers brought no comfort, only a deeper sense of tragedy. The trial was far from over, but one thing had become painfully clear. The fight for justice had already left scars that would never heal. The truth had surfaced, but with it came a darkness that would haunt everyone who had loved Omar and Alejandra. And as the gavel struck to close another day in court, the silence that followed felt heavier than any words spoken inside those walls. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day peeling away another layer of deception. Newspapers splashed headlines across their front pages, radios carried updates every hour, and whispers filled the cafes and markets of Cochabamba. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Would justice truly prevail, or would the truth be buried beneath influence and manipulation? As the prosecution built its case, the weight of evidence began to crush the defense's narrative. Witnesses who had once been silent came forward with fragments of information, phone calls overheard, strange meetings late at night, subtle threats whispered in passing. Piece by piece, the puzzle sharpened into something undeniable. Omar's murder wasn't an act of impulse or chance. It was a deliberate orchestration. And Alejandra's death was a consequence no one had cared to prevent. The courtroom became an arena of emotions so raw that even seasoned judges struggled to maintain order. Each photograph shown, each recording played, drove home the cruelty of the betrayal. The prosecution's voice rang out with cold precision. This was not a robbery. This was not random violence. This was blood traded for money. The accused sat rigid, faces a mixture of defiance and fear. Their lawyers clung to arguments about circumstantial evidence, about gaps in the timeline, about the lack of a murder weapon. But the audience could feel it. The tide had turned. Every whisper, every glance exchanged in that packed room carried the weight of certainty. Outside, the people demanded justice. Murals of Omar appeared on walls, his face painted with bold strokes of defiance. His teammates led marches, their taekwondo uniforms blending with the banners they carried, each step echoing the demand for truth. Alejandra's family lit candles every night, their vigils casting faint glows into the dark, as if daring the shadows to swallow them whole. Inside the court, the turning point came with a piece of forensic evidence. Microscopic traces that tied the accused to the crime scene, details so small they could have been overlooked, yet devastating in their clarity. The defense faltered, their argument suddenly hollow. Whispers grew into gasps when a key suspect broke under cross-examination. Words spilled out, jagged and bitter, revealing cracks in the fragile web of lies. What was meant to be a shield of denial shattered, leaving fragments of the truth exposed for everyone to see. The atmosphere grew heavier with every passing day. Families on both sides avoided eye contact, their grief twisting into hatred. The trial was no longer just about guilt or innocence. It had become a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of human greed, envy, and betrayal. When the prosecution finally rested its case, the silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Everyone knew the verdict would not just determine the fate of the accused, it would decide whether Omar and Alejandra's deaths would be honored with justice or drowned in the corruption that too often silenced the truth. And yet, even as the trial reached its climax, a chilling thought lingered in the minds of many. Justice, once delivered, could never bring the dead back. The scars left behind were permanent, and the ghosts of that night would never truly be silenced. The day of the verdict arrived like a storm, hanging heavy over the city. From the early hours of the morning, crowds gathered outside the courthouse, their voices rising in chants that shook the air. "Justicia para Omar y Alejandra!" echoed through the streets of Cochabamba, a demand that had become the heartbeat of a restless city. Inside, the courtroom was suffocating with tension. Every seat was filled, every eye fixed on the bench, where the judges would soon speak. The accused sat in silence, their faces pale, eyes darting nervously toward the floor. Their lawyers whispered frantic last-minute arguments, but the desperation in their tones betrayed what they already knew. This battle had been lost long before the verdict would be spoken. When the judges entered, the room fell into absolute silence. Papers rustled softly, the sound of pens tapping echoed like distant drums of war. The lead judge's voice broke the stillness, firm and unyielding. After reviewing all evidence, testimony, and forensic detail, this court finds the accused guilty. Words detonated like an explosion. Gasps filled the air, tears spilled down cheeks, and cries of relief burst from Omar's teammates and Alejandra's family. For them, justice had finally been spoken aloud. Yet, mingled with the relief was sorrow so deep it seemed endless. No sentence, no punishment, could return what was stolen from them. The condemned were led away in shackles, their once proud stares now shattered. Some cursed, others stayed silent, but the weight of their downfall was undeniable. They had gambled, with lives for greed and power, and lost everything. Outside, the city erupted. Fireworks cracked against the dark sky, and candlelight vigils turned into marches of triumph. Omar's name was shouted with pride, his memory elevated beyond the tragedy of his death. Alejandra's family held each other tightly, whispering prayers into the night, their grief no less heavy, but finally recognized by justice. Still, amid the celebrations, an uneasy truth lingered. Justice in the courtroom did not erase the blood spilled in the shadows. The pain carved into the families, lives would never fade, and the memory of betrayal would forever haunt them. The case had ended, but the ghosts of that night would continue to whisper through the streets of Cochabamba, a reminder of how fragile life and loyalty truly are. In the end, the verdict wasn't just a punishment for the guilty, it was a warning, etched into history. Greed could corrupt, betrayal could kill, but justice, though slow, could still rise from the ashes. And in that truth, Omar and Alejandra's names were immortalized, not as victims, but as symbols of resilience against the darkest shadows of human cruelty.